So as the title of this webinar suggests, this is a presentation on skill sets of project managers. As Susan mentioned, in the 16 years that I've been an IT project manager and program manager, I've seen a lot of different types of people who are successful in the project management community. And I can tell you that those are the folks that are not necessarily experts in a particular technique, but people that have a certain set of skills. And so the premise of this webinar today is to talk about the landscape of the project management and the business community, talk about some of the trends that have impacted us as project management professionals over the last 10 years, and then talk about those skills that really make people successful in the environment that was just laid out. And the premise is that the marketplace is changing, and therefore the skill sets required to be successful as a project manager have to change as well. And the reason I wrote this presentation, which did evolve into a book, was that I saw a lot of content in the marketplace around project management techniques. How do you make a risk log? How do you make a project plan? And there really weren't many around how to be a successful project manager from a skill set perspective. In fact, if you do a search on Amazon.com and type in project management techniques, I think you'll find there's something like 300,000 responses come back. However, if you type in project management skills, I want to say it was about 3,000 responses back. So 1% of the content that's out there in the marketplace is on the skills required to be successful. And so that's really why I wrote this, and so we'll jump into it now. So I'm going to talk about this presentation in the context of a metaphor. So in the good old days of project management, the project manager was the orchestra conductor. And the entire orchestra was playing music together. Everybody reported to the conductor, the project manager. Everybody was playing well together, and they made great music. But what happened was, you see, the business of orchestras got more competitive. And as a result, orchestra management decided to make a bunch of changes. Let's hope the animation works here in my clicker. And so management comes to the conductor and says, you know, I've decided we spend way too much money on our orchestra, and those flute players are really, really expensive resources. So what I've decided to do is I'm going to outsource our flute player, and we're going to have them in an offshore capacity. So now they're a virtual team member who's on that. And the conductor said, okay, you know, makes sense from a business perspective. And management said, well, hold on, we're not done yet. You know, those drums players, it's more of a commodity, and anybody can really play drums. So what we've decided is we're going to centralize all the drum players into a shared service organization, and they're all going to work together, and they're going to share experiences, and therefore we'll gain experience. But what that means is now there's more conductors, right? So because it's a shared services, I now have to compete for my drum player with other conductors and other orchestras. And then management said, but you know, the business of making music has gotten much more complex. So we're going to add a xylophone player, we're going to add a banjo player, we're going to add an accordion player, because music has just become a lot more complex. And the conductor said, okay, great, makes sense. And they said, you know, but we think you're thinking too small. So instead of a fiddle player, we want to think bigger. We want to think enterprise. So we're going to add the big cello into the orchestra. And lastly, you know, we found this great vendor product that plays pianos, fantastic. So instead of piano being a competency of ours, we're actually going to purchase it. We're going to buy a vendor product, piano in a box. And, oh, by the way, conductor, we've also decided there's more steps that you need to take to do your job successfully. And so at the end of this, if you look at the orchestra metaphor, I think this is the business that we're in today. So because business has become more complex, we're in an environment where there's sourcing, where there's shared service organizations, where it's a more complex environment, where it's a broader focus, where we're using vendor products instead of building things. And there's a lot more steps that we need to take and processes to do our jobs. So I would propose this is a metaphor of the way that we need to do our jobs as conductors of our orchestras or leaders of our projects. And as a result of this makeup, the skills required to be successful, it's no longer everybody reports to me and I wave my wand and they all do what I say. It's a different skill set. So let's talk about that. So the business landscape is changing. I think everybody knows global competition, more demanding shareholders. Obviously, technology has become a critical part of most companies' strategy and certainly their expense. And you can't talk about the economy without talking about the volatile markets. And so as a result, a lot of companies, most companies that want to survive, are really transforming their IT agendas. And they're looking at things like reducing the cost of IT. So while IT is strategic, it also is millions and millions of dollars worth of cost for companies to maintain. But at the same time, the resources have to become more productive. And as I mentioned, IT then has to support the strategies of the companies. And so because of those strategies and the transformation agendas of the companies, projects are changing. So in the not so recent world, resources reported to the project manager, everybody sat together, the PM owned the assets, and there was one sponsor that they had to work with. Well, in the world we just talked about, it's less direct influence, things like shared services, offshore resources, consultants that don't report to you anymore, less direct control over the work, so instead of building things internally, we're buying products, we're working and negotiating with other organizations. There's a whole lot of standards and procedures coming from people outside our division, whether it's company organizations or whether it's government entities. And then there's a lot more governance and stakeholders that need to be engaged with. So the premise here is that the projects are changing as a result of the changing business environment. And so as a result, the skill sets on the left side here, where I'm a PM and I manage a plan and I tell people to do stuff because they report to me, doesn't work anymore because people now don't report to you. And so it requires softer skill sets, more consultative skill sets. So instead of managing a plan, I'm now managing relationships and integration of components. Instead of telling people what to do, I have to negotiate with them for their time. I have to facilitate discussions. Instead of just sending one status report, I now have to navigate my organization and maintain stakeholder relationships. And there's many different stakeholders, and you're really becoming a salesperson for your product. So clearly the skill sets on the right are very different than the skill sets on the left. And I think as project management professionals, we have to recognize that that's what the economy and the business and the marketplace has become, and these are the skill sets that are going to make us successful. In an environment where nobody reports to us, if I just yell at somebody and tell them to do it, what's the probability that they're going to actually do what I say and call me back? And then I won't get any work done. So I would actually propose that the skill sets on the left side are actually detrimental to the new side, the new world. And so what I'm going to do now is, there's really two parts to this presentation. One, talk about the landscape, and let's go into more detail about what that actually means. You know, let's talk about that orchestra metaphor. And then I'll talk about the skill sets required. And in that landscape, I think there's four major trends across business. And this is my opinion, so we can debate this later. But the first one is a focus on reducing cost, whether that's cheaper resources or pooling. Technology that we work with has clearly become more complex, requiring additional rigor, and then the dynamics of the workforce have also changed. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into each of these areas, talk about what they mean. I think that's probably straightforward for most of the folks on this phone call, but then relate that to what that means to us as project management professionals. So from a cost perspective, there's really two, and I'll jump into them. I think everybody knows sourcing. So the business premise here is pretty simple. Move the work offshore for labor arbitrage, where you have resources who work at a lower cost. Theoretically, the quality is supposed to be higher because a lot of these organizations are CMMI or somehow accredited. Another capability that you get is additional capacity of labor. So in an area where maybe it's more volatile of resources, you don't have to hire people, you can use offshore resources to fill those gaps. And again, it makes sense from a business perspective, but what does that mean to us as project managers? A couple things. So one, a lot more attention. So I think as organizations move to sourcing models, they find that the sourcing company